Hi, welcome to another video series. This time we're taking on the subject of the conquest in the Americas. To do so, we're going to survey the establishment of three different empires across the Americas, and we will do so taking into consideration these three stories about outsiders. We're talking about 15th century outside empire builders who took advantage of new and distinct modes of warfare in each case. They also took advantage of divisions and rivalries in the area that they sought to conquer, all the while acquiring allies to subvert the existing balance of power in the region. They used existing traditions later on to establish a new order to justify their arrival to power, and they were also able to exact strict modes of domination by taking advantage of local elites. Now, you might be thinking that this, of course, is corresponding to the arrival of the Europeans, but you would only be partially correct, because we're also talking about the establishment of the Mexica and the Inca empires that meet all of these criteria that I just described. So let's begin with our first story, the Inca Empire, and discuss a little bit about state building in the pre-colonial Andean world. So the Inca Empire is the largest, the most complex empire that was ever developed in the Americas. The Inca people, ruled by the Sapa Inca, was called by the Incas Tawantinsuyu, that is the land of four parts, because the empire was subdivided into four great administrative regions, each of which was ruled by a local governor. But all of them had to respond to the Sapa Inca, who ruled in the intersection of all these quarters in the city of Cusco. Cusco means navel, the center of this empire. And it's important to note that the Incas were newcomers to the Cusco Valley. And also important to note is the fact that the Incas developed a very complex bureaucratic and infrastructural network in order to control this huge realm of theirs. They also organized the labor across the empire using a taxation system that is called the mita. And we will discuss the mita in a little bit more detail, because the Spaniards would take on the mita and use it afterwards to control local population in Peru. It was truly a huge empire, and the Sapa Inca controlled the lives of 10 million inhabitants. So it was truly a large political entity, and also large in terms of its extension. If you were to walk from one end of the Inca Empire to the other, you would walk about 5,800 kilometers. That's only about 100 kilometers short of the distance that's between Cordoba, Spain, and Baku, Azerbaijan. So we're talking about a very large empire indeed. Not only is it large, it's also very diverse in terms of its geography. And the geography basically creates a varied landscape where we have the northern coastal region that is very dry and mostly dominated by desert or truly arid landscapes, where water is scarce and people were dependent on the sea in order to survive, to make a living. Moving further inland, we would get to the highlands. And when we say highlands, we truly are talking about high lands. The highest peaks of the Andes reach more than 6,600 meters above sea level. So, and the city of Cusco, the capital of the Incas, was well above 3,000 meters above sea level. So these are highlands indeed. The highlands, we can also highlight the area around Lake Titicaca in the south, which was one of the nuclei of cultural flourishment and Inca expansion early on. Later, if you would move further east, down the slopes of the Andes mountain chain, you would arrive to the Amazon basin, yet again creating more biodiversity, more change, and more resources that the Inca were able to tap into. It's also important to note that all this area is subjected to the El Niño weather cycle. This is a cycle that periodically brings warm water across the Pacific and down the North American and South American coast. And in South America, it causes the disruption of marine life because it creates a rise in temperature that kills the plankton that marine life in the area depend on. So they have to move in order to survive. It also creates massive floods that would tend to destroy irrigation systems that were also key to the survival of the inhabitants of the area. So the El Nino weather cycle shaped the patterns of human settlements by periodically forcing societies to experiment with new forms of political organization. So the Andean world has a deep history, and the Incas are only a blip in the history of the Andean world, and that's why we're just going to go over the deep history of the region very succinctly, because we are only going to be able to scratch the surface. And we will see a pattern of rise and fall of civilizations much in the same vein as Mesoamerica, only in a much longer time frame. So first of all, let's point out the mummification tradition in the area. The oldest mummies would probably surprise you, are not from Egypt. In fact, we have mummies from the Andean region, from the Atacama Desert, that are dated to 5,000 before the Common Era, BCE. That's 2,000 years earlier than the very first Egyptian mummies. But unlike Egyptian mummies, these mummified remains, present no signs of social hierarchy. That is to say, all mummies that have been found are not associated with very rich funerary trappings or anything like that, as in the Egyptian case. So we are looking at a burial pattern that tends to be somewhat more egalitarian. The mummification tradition carries on throughout Andean history, well into the Inca period. So it's a tradition that is at least 6,500 years in its development. So it remained a central aspect of Andean religious life, a way to interact with ancestors, and also to establish political lineage to a certain area. The very first civilization, city building civilization in the Andes is the Norte Chico civilization that's contemporary with ancient Sumer, ancient Ashur, the very earliest Babylonian Empire. And this developed in the north central coast, and it has three main sites, Aspero, Caral, and El Paraíso. And these are the very first cities in the Americas. The cities on the coast traded maritime food supplies for crops cultivated in the cities a little bit further in the interior valleys. So they developed around this trade network, just as we saw in our previous series on the development of political entities and trade. So they already featured pyramid-like monumental architecture called huacas. Huacas are a predominant feature of Andean monument building, and these huacas actually predated the very first pyramids in Egypt by half a millennia. So these are very old structures indeed. Interestingly, they present no ceramics, so they did not use pottery, and they did, however, managed to develop a lot of textiles, including the planting of cotton. They were using this cotton to make nets for fishing, and also the remains of the very first quipus. We will talk about quipus in a little bit more detail. Quipus are a writing or proto-writing system. There's debate around that, but it's a series of knots, of threads with knots to keep records. So the Norte Chico civilization might have also developed some of the very earliest forms of writing in the world. Following Norte Chico, Chavin culture flourishes. This was previously regarded as the mother culture of the Andes. It has now been shown that much earlier civilizations existed in the Andes. But Chavin, nonetheless, was the model for political authority through religion across the Andes, and we can see its effects and its influence carry over many centuries. The architectural style follows a tradition from the coastal cities, but the religion may have come from the Amazon. It's situated in a fertile area, good for herding of camelids, that is llamas, alpacas, but also farming. And it's in a place that is strategic for communication between the coast and the Amazon. So that's where Chavin, roughly contemporary with the Olmecs that you might remember from our video on Mesoamerica, that's where Chavin developed. So the iconography of Chavin shows felines that are not native to the area where the city developed. And we also have the appearance of a deity that will reappear over and over in various sites across time in the Andean region. That's the so-called Fang deity, which is a humanoid in form with snakes coming out of the hair and the waist, and also feline features in its face, in its head. Public art in this site in Chavin reflected a certain shamanistic practices that were also related to consumption of hallucinogenic plants. And the consumption of hallucinogenic plants continues to be an important practice in shamanistic rituals in the Andes and the Amazon to this day. Chavin de Huantar, which is the name of the main site of the Chavin culture, may have been the epicenter of a cult or the site of an oracle, and it remained a major place of pilgrimage for many centuries before its decline. After the decline of Chavin, but moving further south, also in the coastal region, a very dry area, that's where the Nazca culture developed somewhat later than Chavin. It's most famous for the Nazca lines, these enormous geoglyphs that may have been pilgrimage itineraries that can only be seen or truly admired from the air. These Nazca lines drawn across the plateau of the Nazca region. But they also developed, the Nazca people, underground irrigation systems to take advantage of the very scarce water resources. They also, because of course they were living in a very dry environment, they also developed beautiful polychrome ceramics that represented an advancement in the techniques that were being employed to make pottery in the Andean world. And they also produce, of course, fine textiles. And really, textile production, both in cotton and wool, represent some of the finest traits of many Andean civilization. The Nazca, of course, is one of such cases. But they do also reflect some sort of somewhat egalitarian society. There's not much evidence of a very strong centralized government to speak of. So that's also an interesting trait of this culture. The Moche, on the other hand, developed somewhat simultaneously. They did have an elite, as evidenced by the very rich tombs that they constructed. They also constructed many huacas across the landscape. So they are a stratified society, very well known for their goldsmithing abilities, and people in the Andean world are making copper alloys and goldsmithing and working with other metals from very early on. And the Moche also represent a moment in time where the Andean world becomes more interested in warfare, as depicted in many forms of public art. And also maize became the staple crop for the Moche. The maize, first domesticated in Mexico, came down via Central America, what is now and later on what is now Colombia, Ecuador, and finally made its way to Peru. And the Moche truly focused on agriculture of maize crops enabling them to grow their population and establish a wide area of influence. They also pioneered in road building, and as we shall see, road building was essential to the development of the Inca Empire. So many traits that we associate with the Inca were, such as building of infrastructure, was actually pioneered by the Moche some 8 centuries before the emergence of the Inca Empire. The Moche are most famous for their art, and of course, Huaca de la Luna is perhaps its most impressive architectural remain. It's spread across the central and northern valleys along the coast. Still, we're not clear or certain whether it was a single political entity or instead a collection of independent city-states sharing common cultural features, such as we saw in the case of the Maya in our Mesoamerica discussion. The huacas that the Moche built featured murals with carvings and reliefs of the Andean Fang deity, animals such as, and insects such as spiders, and human motifs covering the entire facade of the huaca. So they were truly beautiful buildings that would stand out in the dry environment from very far, far away. Moche ceramics are also very interesting, very famous for their depiction of very explicit erotic scenes, mostly recreational, non-reproductive erotic scenes. And we also have depictions of warfare and very interesting and beautiful lifelike portraits predating lifelike representations in the Italian Renaissance by quite a few centuries. Moving further down south, but contemporary with the Moche culture, we finally reached the city of Tiahuanaco that developed in the Lake Titicaca region. This was perhaps the largest city in the Andean world. It may have reached as many as 40,000 inhabitants, ruling over a polity that may have had as many as 500,000 people. So it was truly an impressive political entity. And it's most famous for innovations such as raised fields that would help preserve heat for the crops. For the nighttime, they would raise the platforms where they planted their crops, and the fact that they raised those platforms would enable heat to come out of those structures at night to help the plant survive the very, very harsh and cold weather of the highlands. They also built artificial fisheries associated to those raised fields. In fact, the fish helped improve the fertility of the raised fields. And of course, they're most famous for their master stonework. As you can see in the picture, in the gate of the sun that you can see pictured here, they would cut the stone with very precise angles, very precise techniques, almost as if they were using industrial machinery or they were pouring concrete. But these are stone carvings. So they were succeeded after the fall of Tiahuanaco. They were succeeded by various Aymara polities, and Aymara is a people group that still live in the region today. Perhaps the most impressive piece of Tiahuanaco architecture is a Calasasaya temple in the middle of the city. Again, contemporary to Moche and Tiahuanaco, we have the emergence of the Wari Empire that, again, it's unclear whether it was an actual empire or a collection of city-states that shared common cultural or religious traits. But the Wari Empire was contemporary with the Moche, with the Tiahuanaco and the Nazca, and they also feature very large stone architecture that the Incas would also incorporate into the way they built their city. We're talking about grid-like cities that were organized in grids, multi-story buildings, and they, of course, pioneer in the development of agricultural terraces, where they would plant corn and especially potatoes. The potato had been present in the Andes for many centuries before, but it's truly with the Wari that potatoes become the major staple of these people. And so you can thank the Waris for your French fries. And they also, as the Moche and the Chavin people, the Moche people and the Incas would do after them, they developed road infrastructure to connect the various cities. And of course, they were also famous for herding llamas and llamas and alpaca throughout. So moving a little bit forward in time, but back into the region of the northern coastal deserts, the Chimu culture developed from the year 1100. This Chimu culture was a single political entity, the Chimor Kingdom, with its capital in Chanchan. And Chanchan features a series of huge enclosures, some 100 meters by 100 meters enclosures, or even larger than that. These are called the ciudadelas, that were perhaps the palaces of the various rulers of the city. Inside those enclosures, there were U-shaped structures that are called the audiencias. These are large structures where they would conceivably have held court of or conduct other type of governmental business. It had a century of expansion, so it was the second largest polity or empire that developed in the Andean world, and it had, like I said, a century of expansion until it was where it conquered another civilization that we're not going to see in too much detail as you can, until they were finally defeated by the Inca. Its last ruler deposed, the mummies of Chimu of Chanchan taken to the capital city, the Inca capital city of Cusco. So this is the panorama of the Andes, where when the Inca began their expansion. In the north, we have the empire or the kingdom of Chimor. We have the Nazca settlements further down south, and the Aymara kingdoms around Lake Titicaca and further down south. And in the center of it all, we have this very small kingdom of Cusco. Now, the kingdom of Cusco was founded by the Inca, of course. And the Inca have various mythologies concerning their origin, but there seems to be, all of them agree, in fact, that there was a migration out of a sacred cave, Pacaritambo. And this sacred cave, out of this cave came the lineage of the Incas, 8 siblings, 4 brothers and 4 sisters, that started a pilgrimage looking for the place where Inti, the sun god, would show them where to found their city. And finally, they reached the valley of Cusco, and they determined that this was the place. So the Inca, later on known as the Quechua people, so Quechua-speaking, were Quechua-speaking nomadic invaders who seized the Cusco Valley over a period of time. Now, there's a mixture of mythology and history and legend, so it's hard to ascertain really the history of the earlier rulers of Cusco. But in all the chronicles establish that there is a genealogy of 12 Inca rulers, the Sapa Incas, but of course this is an area of some contention. Manco Cápac is the first Inca. He is the person who established the city of Cusco, and is a person that is credited by tradition with organizing its administrative layout. Empire building began much later, after only the 8th Inca, Viracocha Inca, was deposed after failing to defeat an invading force, the Chanca people. So this is where we can really begin to talk about Inca empire building proper. So the Inca ruling elite, by the way, practiced royal incest. That is, they would marry their sisters to keep the royal lineage secure and pure. And this was a tradition started by Manco Cápac. Manco Cápac remained an important mythological figure, almost or legendary figure, almost like King Arthur in the minds of of the Quechua people for centuries later on. The Inca Empire, however, was developed by Pachacuti. This is a person who managed to defeat the Chanca invaders, and he renewed authority through either renewing the cult of the sun god Inti, or the creation god Viracocha. There is much debate surrounding this, but he renewed the religious authority of the Sapa Inca. He also developed the Mita taxation form that we will discuss in a moment, and he's responsible for directly conquering the Lake Titicaca region and the major farmlands in the highlands surrounding Cusco Valley. His relatives continued this momentum of conquest, and one of them, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, became his successor. During Pachacuti's lifetime, Tupac Inca carried on several expeditions, particularly to the north, where they would conquer the Chimor Empire, or the Chimor Kingdom, and finally reaching the Kingdom of Quito in present-day Ecuador, which was some of the latest acquisitions by the Inca. He also turned down south to incorporate several Aymara kingdoms further down south. His successor, Huayna Capac, was responsible for some conquests again in the north, when he incorporated the Chachapoyas in the Amazon fringe, and this sovereign, this ruler, is famous also because he actually died of smallpox. The Europeans were establishing themselves in areas further north, particularly in Panama, and they brought with them new diseases to which Amerindians had no defenses against. So smallpox reached the Inca Empire during Huayna Capac's reign, and he saw many of his people succumb to this disease, and unfortunately he himself died of smallpox. Not only did he die, his designated successor also died. So the death of Huayna Capac and his successors prompted a civil war between different contenders to the Inca kingdom, Huáscar and Atahualpa. And this was a huge civil war between these two contending pretenders that were able to mobilize very large armies. So it further debilitated the Inca state capacity for warfare. And this is how the Spanish conquistadors, the Spanish conquerors, found the Inca Empire: divided, wrought with disease, and weakened by civil strife. But before we get to that, let's discuss Inca architecture and Inca administration. Now, they are most famous for the stonework that they developed. They use no mortar in their stone buildings, so they would just fit stones one with another, perhaps using a naturally occurring acid of some sort, or simply developing a very fine, a very well developed carving technique. Some of the most impressive examples of that is Inca Roca's palace in the city of Cusco, which is today it's the base of the Archbishop's palace in Cusco, so it can still be visited. Here's a picture of that. And we also have the complex of Sacsayhuaman in the outskirts of Cusco, which was believed to be a fortress, but really it seems to be just a place for major functions, major events. But the Inca are also famous for the development of infrastructures, in particular roads, because wherever they went, the Inca would construct roads. And this helped communication across the empire. They aided the movement of armies. They were well maintained. They were all-weather road network. So communications were fantastic in the Inca Empire. Local peoples would tend to these roads, to the bridges, to the infrastructure as part of the labor requirements that the Inca imposed on them. And this is thanks to the MITA system. So the MITA system, I've already mentioned, but I'm going to explain a little bit more detail. It's a community-based labor taxation system. So rather than demand tribute, just like objects, the Inca would rather demand work. They would demand labor. So they would tax people on what they were able to do, whether they were farmers or artisans. They would establish a quota, and this person would then produce whatever was required of them. It was based on a census, or a series of censuses taken to determine in every town what each individual was best suited to contribute to the empire. So it all worked on a base 10 system of organization. So 100 people were supervised by a single foreman. This foreman was part of a 10-person group that was supervised in turn by an Inca official. And in every town there were, say, 100 officials who would organize the distribution of whatever it is that town would produce. These goods would later be distributed throughout the empire. So the production that you would do as an individual, 1/3 would be for your own personal use or consumption. 1/3 would go to your local community, and 1/3 would go as tribute for the empire, to Cusco, for the Zapa Inca. So, and we're talking about all sorts of products: food, ceramics, textiles, wood products, feathers, metalwork. Depending on the area where your town was, it would specialize in particular products according to the local availability of resources. And the Incas would use a series of warehouses. These warehouses were called colcas, as you can, like the one you can see here, pictured in Ollantaytambo, and there they would be stored for distribution, and it would be the Inca officials that would distribute all these resources. Allegedly, the Inca Empire were able to supply food equally across the empire, and it is said that there was no hunger in the empire, although this might be an exaggeration. So apart from the colcas, we also had a series of tambos. Now, tambos were outposts where runners would live, and they would then run from one tambo to the next to convey messages, to convey reports. So this is a very efficient runner communication system where each tambo would be 30 kilometers apart from the next. And so messages were able to reach one end of the empire to the other in a very fast way. Now, here's an example of, here's another picture from Ollantaytambo, obviously a tambo, and you can also see the terraces. This is the height of agricultural terrace buildings, first pioneered by the Wari, but really perfected by the Incas, where especially potato, but also other crops would be grown and distributed across the empire. And the Inca army was also formed by these farmers. So there were farmers that would use part of their mita labor commitment would be used to serve in the army. And this way the Inca were able to raise very large armies. And we're talking truly large armies. 100,000 armies, strong armies were actually commonplace. The Inca were able to raise these sort of forces, and even 200,000 armies were reported to have been drafted by the Inca. Women would accompany the army. Very often, the wives of the soldiers would travel along with them as part of their mita requirement as well. And there would be herds of llama and alpaca traveling alongside the army, supplying them with wool and meat and other products that they would need. So it was a very efficient machinery, and it was due to this very sophisticated mita labor taxation system. So Inca rule over its empire was very direct. And the only way that they were able to maintain this very direct control was through quipus. that we've already mentioned. And you can see a picture here. It's a series of knotted strands that were used for record keeping. And there is a lot of debate whether the information that these quipus recorded were simply statistics or numbers, such as an abacus would, or whether they were able to convey more sophisticated information. So is it a writing system or isn't it? There is some debate. However, it could be, it is possible that it could be read by people who were trained in doing so, like a pentagram, or even something akin to a binary code, where different meanings would be conveyed by the position of the knot in the strand, the color of the strand, the shape of the knot, and various other indications. So this is still something that is not being established by scholars yet, but it's very exciting to imagine that this could be a whole different writing support, as a whole different writing system that is still ready to be decoded. So, and people were still able to decode them in the 16th century. In fact, Inca quipu readers traveled to Europe to show this technique to European monarchs. So before we leave the Inca Empire, I just thought it's worth mentioning Machu Picchu. It's important to mention this is not a city. It's an estate that belonged to the Sapa Inca. It's one of many leisure residences that were built for the Inca. It's the best preserved and perhaps the most photogenic one, but it's not a city. It was built during the reign of Pachacuti and his successor for their enjoyment. So closer to a leisure palace than to a temple or a pilgrimage site. It was rather a place to hold court in certain times of the year. So that was the first story. Let's move on to the second story of an outsider group that established an empire in the 15th century, and that would be the Mexica Empire. And I'm gonna be using the term Mexica instead of Aztec, mostly. And the reason is that Mexica is a proper name that these people call themselves. Aztec was only introduced widely in the 19th century. So really the proper term to call this empire is Mexica Empire. And that brings us back to Mesoamerica. We did mention in our video about Mesoamerica, in the very final section of it, that the Mexica were immigrants. They have various stories about their migration, and there's some conflicting stories about whether they came from a place called Chicomostoc or Aztlán. Chicomostoc, the place of 7 caves, or Aztlán, the place of cranes. Both of these places are semi-mythological. It's very unclear whether we're talking about real places or something else. But you'll know that it's interesting to see that Chicomostoc was a cave, just in the same way as the Inca said that they emerged from a sacred cave as well. So there is this weird coincidence. The chronicles speak of different Nahuatl-speaking groups. And these Nahuatl groups would live in Chicomostoc and live in succession, displaced, to establish themselves in the Valley of Mexico around Lake Texcoco. And these various groups occupied different city-states around the lake. And the Mexica, the Aztecs, were only the last ones to leave Chicomostoc and the last ones to arrive in Lake Texcoco. Now we have a series of migration stories. Very likely that these stories, well, it's not very likely. We know that these stories were shaped by Aztec or Mexica nobility later on. So in many ways, it can be read also as propaganda, in that we're not so different. We're newcomers, but we also belong to the same lineage. So they must be taken with a little pinch of salt. So where did the Aztec or the Mexica come from? Well, Nahuatl-speaking groups belong to a larger language family called the Uto-Aztecan language family that can be found in many places across the western section of North America, all throughout northwestern Mexico, the southwest United States, and areas of present-day states of Wyoming, and even southern Montana, and places like that. People groups such as the Apache or the Comanche belong to this language family, same as the Mexica. So the Nahuatl-speaking peoples could have come from anywhere where Uto-Aztecan languages are spoken. So it's still a matter of debate. Many sites have been proposed as possible places for Chicomostoc or Aztlán, but it is unclear. We do know that this is a migrating group that entered Mesoamerica late, sometime in the 13th century. So when the Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico, by the way, the Valley of Mexico is called the Valley of Mexico because of the Mexica. They entered in the 1200s, and they were latecomers. There were already various Nahuatl-speaking groups there that had taken over from previous cultures, the ones that we have discussed in the Mesoamerica episodes, so Chicalco, Tula, these places. And they live in the Mexica, according to their chronicles, in less than hospitable places such as Chapultepec or Biscuac, very arid, rugged places where they would survive eating snakes. And they would be doing that, serving various chiefdoms, various polities around the lake. And they would serve them by serving as mercenaries. So the Mexica, very early on in their history, are already associated with a cult of war, with a warlike type society, where Huitzilopochtli, their main war god, was central. So Lake Texcoco is actually a system of lakes, shallow lake system. It's only 2 meters deep. Well, it was 2 meters deep. The lake no longer exists. It's now been taken over by the sprawl of Mexico City. But it was partly fresh, partly brackish waters. And in fact, there was a levee, a dam that was constructed, the Zahualcoyotl's levee, to prevent the brackish water to enter the fresh water area. And various city-states, various altepetls with Nahuatl elites ruled the lake. They were all independent from each other, but engaged in different alliances and different power struggles. The most important or the dominant city-state at the time of Aztec arrival was the city of Azcapotzalco. It was the capital of the Tepanec people, and they were really the ones that dominated the lake. So the Aztecs really had no place to settle until finally they decided to settle on a very small island in the center of the lake. And this is the place where they founded 2 cities. One of them is Mexico Tenochtitlan, and traditionally it was founded in 1325. Although that's only according to the chronicles. And another city, Mexico Tlatelolco, was founded in the island right next to it. So the Mexica had 2 cities, and they grew these little island communities slowly in the middle of Texcoco lakes. And they grew these cities, they expanded these cities by constructing chinampas. Now, chinampas are artificial islands that are built by using reeds and various trees to secure an area where you would dump dirt and refuse, and this would create a very fertile patch of land that would enable you to secure many crops year-round. And these chinampas eventually developed into something like what you see in the picture, and the people would build their houses atop of them, and they would grow their crops, mainly beans and squash and maize on these chinampas. They were so fertile that the Europeans described them as floating gardens when they saw them. So the chinampa truly helped the Mexica secure a food supply, and that enabled, of course, population growth. Using this method, this Chinampa system, the cities of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, and Mexico, Tlatelolco, grew and grew and grew until they eventually merged into a single huge city of about 100,000 people, maybe more. It's unclear of the real size, but it was really one of the largest cities ever constructed in Mesoamerica, and at the time of European contact, one of the largest in the world as well. Dominating this island, this Venice-like city in the lake, crisscrossed by canals and connected to the mainland with huge causeways. This city featured a zoo, an opera house. It was clean, according to the Europeans. Were amazed of how clean it was, and it was really a major trading center for the products that it would secure later on as it developed its empire. So it truly astonished Europeans when they saw it. Mexico, Tenochtitlan was dominated by its ceremonial center in the middle of it, where the main temples, those dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, remember Tlaloc from our Teotihuacan discussion, the Templo Mayor, where featured these temples, and they dominated this area in the center of the city. And of course, this is where human sacrifices, for which the Mexica and the Aztecs are infamous across the world, this is where they took place, of course. This is also a place where the major palaces and residences of the nobility and the ruling elite were built. Large, comfortable stone buildings with flat roofs and cedar timber roofs. So, but before that, before they constructed this humongous city, the Aztecs first came to dominate their empire. And this empire was actually based on an alliance with another two cities that were around Lake Texcoco, the city of Texcoco and the city of Tacuba or Tlacopan. This alliance between these three cities, that is why it's called the Triple Alliance, was orchestrated by the rulers, the Tlatoanis of Tenochtitlan and Texcoco, Izcoatl and Nezahualcóyotl. This last figure was truly a Renaissance man. He was an engineer, he was a statesman, he was the person responsible for building the major aqueducts that supply water to these cities, and also, of course, the levee that kept the brackish water from the fresh water in Lake Texcoco. The Triple Alliance destroyed Azcapotzalcan hegemony of Lake Texcoco and slowly increased its power until eventually they would take over the entire Texcoco Lake area. And this alliance was perfected by a Mexica statesman, Tlacaelel, the classic man behind the throne, and his brother Moctezuma the First, who would rule after Izcoatl. So this Triple Alliance conquered various city-states across the lake and then moving beyond, and they divided the tribute supplied by these conquered peoples. However, Tenochtitlan gradually became a more important part of this alliance and eventually overshadowed Texcoco and Tlacopan. So in a way, the Aztec Empire, it's really more similar to the Athenian Empire, whereby Athens was able to secure political domination over a large area in Greece using the alliance of Delos. So the Delian League became the Athenian Empire in a way similar to how the Triple Alliance became the Mexica Empire. So Mexica society was very stratified. We have slaves, and then above those we had commoners, farmers, artisans, warriors. Later on we had a merchant class, which was actually hereditary merchants. This was an entirely different class. It's sort of like a middle class, the Pochteca. And the Pochteca were the traders that were essential for Aztec expansion throughout Mesoamerica. And then above those, we have the nobility, and a very small sector of this nobility were actually related to the Tlatoani. So these are the royalty, the royal family. And it's worth mentioning that the Aztec or the Mexica emperor, the king, was an elected office. It was not a normal hereditary succession. Rather, the nobility elected the Way Tlatoani, the great Tlatoani, the great speaker, the great ruler from among the nobility. And there was some opportunity for social mobility for the lower ranks of society, but social mobility was based on military prowess. And military prowess was measured in how many people a particular warrior was able to capture for sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli. So this strict organization based on education through various schooling systems that the Aztecs had, the Calmecac for the nobility, and other schools for the commoners. They helped, that structure helped them develop a very sophisticated, very well-defined military machine with which they would move across Mesoamerica and establish their rule. So just like the Inca Empire, the Aztec or the Mexica Empire is only a blip in Mesoamerica history. It developed very quickly and was truncated with the arrival of the Spanish conquerors. It was only a century of expansion, just like the Inca Empire. So it's also worth noting that the Aztec Empire is not as centralized and as structurally developed as the Inca Empire. Instead, we are looking at a tributary empire. The Pochteca, this merchant class, would move into a new territory to gauge what type of products this new area had, what was worth getting out of those places. And these Pochteca trading outposts would later become garrisons for part of the Mexica army. The rulers of these areas were then invited to Tenochtitlan, where they would see the splendor of the city, the strength of the Aztec armies, and then they would be invited to join the Aztec, the Mexica Empire. A tribute would be set for them, and hopefully they would say yes. If they said no, then the Aztec would attack them, conquer them, and enforce even heftier tributes upon them. So joining the Mexica Empire or the Triple Alliance Empire willingly was sometimes the smart move. But tribute, not assimilation, was the goal of the Mexica. Local rulers were left alone. In the end, the Aztec or the Mexica Empire is really a system of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, ruling over 450 some client states. And this network of client states worked more like a hegemonic empire. So the Aztecs had suzerainty over them. That is, they ruled through local elites rather than enforcing direct control. So a very different system to what we see with the Inca empires. The Aztecs also developed a very peculiar institution, and that is the Flowery Wars. The Flowery Wars would be conflicts that the Aztecs would, or the Mexica would engage in, where the purpose was not to conquer lands or to acquire more tribute, but instead they would be organized to capture prisoners to be sacrificed to Huitzilopochtli. And according to Aztec history or propaganda, the Aztecs gave the reason why they would not conquer one of their neighbors, and that is the city-state, the Altepetl of Tlaxcala. They said that they left Tlaxcala alone so that it would serve as an enemy for the Flowery Wars. That is, Tlaxcala wouldn't be conquered to force to be to give tribute to the Aztecs. Instead, it would be an enemy that the Aztecs could attack to procure captives for sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli. So in a way, the flowery wars are, this institution are part of the reason why the Europeans were able to defeat them. First of all, the Aztecs focused some of their warfare tradition in capturing enemies rather than killing them, although this point is still debated. But most importantly, they left Tlaxcala unconquered. And Tlaxcala would become a vital, absolutely essential, vital ally for the Spanish conquerors. And so we reach our third story, the Spanish conquerors. But since this is a very complex topic, and I want to discuss this in terms of its historiography as well, so the way that the story has been retold rather than just the story itself, I'm gonna leave this for another video, and I'll see you for that one really, really soon. Thank you.